For now, over 43 months, Russia has been at war with Ukraine. Today we'll examine the military situation there. I'm Julian Ripke, and this is the BILD Situation Room. And we start with the situation around the Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk. There, the Russian army has been attempting to seize the city for over a year now. However, they haven't made much progress. Let's take a look at the new footage released by the Russians. Most likely it was leaked by a soldier, and this footage provides us with a look at a motorcycle unit. And this is a phenomenon that we've seen more and more frequently in recent weeks. The Russians are no longer relying on tanks or armored vehicles, nor are they just attacking on foot. Instead, they're focused on covering vast distances in the shortest possible time. And they're doing this on these motorcycles. As we can see here, we're looking at an entire company, roughly 40 to 50 men in this group. So that means a hastily assembled mechanized company, of course not the classic BMP, but rather motorcycles. Companies that are being formed by the Russian army. We know that most of the soldiers, and we can see it a bit in their facial expressions here, are contract soldiers who have agreed to fight here for a year. Depending on their specific region, they were initially paid amounts ranging from 15,000 to 70,000 euros directly into their accounts for it, that they simply agreed to it. They received it immediately, plus the roughly 3,000 euros per month. All that because it is clear that they have a very low chance to survive. Here we essentially see soldiers saluting. We've only shown half of the video. Each of them introduced themselves here, and the majority were soon killed by the Ukrainians. And of course, that's also in the video, in this case, not by the Russian army, but by the Ukrainian military, which clearly shows how they hunted down these individual motorcyclists through the villages around Pokrovsk and took out every single one of them. We start with an ATV, a transport vehicle. We see it here at the back, a little cart, and there's a soldier sitting on it in the front. However, I think that's also the only ATV we're seeing right now. Everything else are actually precisely these mobile motorcycle units, or mechanized infantry as the Russians officially label them. These specific formations, these assault troops that are designed to charge forward, advance the front lines and seize control of the villages. We see that in the vast majority of cases it all ends tragically, and the motorcycles we just observed, at least presumably, those soldiers are shortly after pursued by the Ukrainians on their bikes, directly hunted down and then struck, with the majority of them being killed in the process. We also see here, especially the initial strikes, meaning on the moving motorcycles. What we're now mostly cutting out is, of course, the subsequent attacks, because once they're demobilized, once these various motorcyclists have either dismounted or crashed, they're still not dead, and the situation remains highly volatile and dangerous. And so the Ukrainians don't chase them down with FPV kamikaze drones afterwards, but rather with these bomb-dropping drones targeting the survivors, or more specifically the wounded Russians, to then make absolutely certain that none of them are left in a condition to keep on fighting. From these images, it's evident that Ukraine urgently requires drones to coordinate these attacks effectively. Not just the attack drones like the bomber or the FPV attack drones, but especially the surveillance drones. That means reconnaissance drones that hover above and effectively coordinate the entire operation. Because only if Ukraine sees where the Russians are, where those motorcycles are advancing quickly, only then can they strike and attack the Russians in those spots. And that's why the Russians are putting so much effort into taking out Ukraine's reconnaissance drones. We're also taking a look at a recent video from the special unit Rubicon, which is currently active in the Pokrovsk region. And we can clearly observe just how remarkably effective this Rubicon unit is, successfully bringing down between 20, 30, 40 Ukrainian drones from the sky every single day. Those are all reconnaissance drones we're observing. Many of them are Leleka models, but here at the start we also see various other types of drones. We'll also see shark drones shortly, which we recently covered in the region, as well as vector drones produced by the German manufacturer Quantum Systems. So this is essentially a chase in the sky. Here we're seeing the first vector drone being actively targeted by the Russian forces. And it's extremely important for the Russians to shoot them down day and night, as we're also seeing here. However, it's also important to clearly say that the Ukrainians have hundreds, if not thousands, of these drones. They're also being built all the time. That means it's always a race. Who can produce more, essentially? It's the classic war of attrition on one side. The Russians send soldiers with motorcycles and they end up getting destroyed and killed. The Ukrainians in turn send reconnaissance and kamikaze drones, and the Russians try to shoot them out of the sky as much as possible. All of this results in a situation around Pokrovsk. We're now showing it in comparison to our last broadcast about 14 days ago, which has hardly changed. You can see it right after 5 seconds. What we just saw were the Russian units, which have been trying to push further in recent weeks, and now we're seeing the changes as of today, which have been attempting to push further. In this area here towards the north, they attempted to cut it off. They had seized Solo-Tikolodjats up there and 9 other villages, but all of them were eventually retaken and liberated by the Ukrainian army. And the Ukrainians are positioned with their combat drones. Yeah, we can see that from up there pretty well. It's 8 kilometers. The maximum range of the drones is about 10 to 20 kilometers maximum. So it's not a big secret when you say that in this belt here, basically all around and also in the north, of course, the Ukrainian drone teams are positioned accordingly and launch their attacks on the Russians from there, who are attempting to push forward on the ground and, of course, seize Pokrovsk. We can see the entire operation is yet another flanking maneuver. In parallel, the Russians are also attacking Myrnohrad, once 40,000, and Pokrovsk, once 65,000 inhabitants. However, they're also stuck there. The Ukrainians are managing, even though there are only very, very few supply routes left. Actually, only 2 roads are still usable, namely these 2 here. The others are all way too close to the front line. The Ukrainians still managed to supply the former 100,000 inhabitant agglomeration of Pokrovsk-Myrnohrad over land routes and are indeed capable of doing so effectively. Even though the Russians are pushing from all sides and also deploying a lot of kamikaze drones, they are able to continue defending war-torn cities, unfortunately now reduced to ruins. Just a few kilometers eastward of Pokrovsk lies yet another town known as Kostiantynivka. And here there's actually once again a lone, isolated tank attack by the Russian army. You can also watch the video about it. In recent weeks, the tank attacks have significantly decreased. The mechanized attacks, as we just mentioned, are often limited to quads and motorcycles. Here, however, a single tank on the move, and once again, we can clearly observe how Ukraine is chasing it and how they obviously immediately damaged it. We just saw the first drone strike here by the 1st Azov Corps, which is defending the Kostiantynivka region. And now, interestingly, we see the tank here apparently has a track damage or a functional issue. It's currently driving the first circle to the right, and shortly after, here we see it once more, driving the second circle to the right. That means apparently the first drone already caused damage here. The Russians then regain control and manage to keep this tank moving forward despite the issue. We can also see from this footage that very often it's not just 1, not just 2, but 5, 6, 7 drones that are needed, while artillery is now also hitting around the tank. 7 drones are required to effectively neutralize and disable such a main battle tank. That means we repeatedly witness the tank being hit with new drones striking it, and ultimately the tank is completely taken out of action, but only after approximately 6 to 7 direct hits in total. The whole thing is a strange sign because we're really seeing here individual tanks keep rolling forward. However, the major attacks we remember back in 2022 and even up to 2024 in Vuhledar, for example, in the south of the Donetsk region there, they used hundreds of tanks and armored vehicles back then to push forward. Now, it's actually a very rare sight to see individual tanks appearing again. We see that the tank continues to have problems here, keeps falling in circles repeatedly, keeps getting hit, and in the end it's also taken out near Kostiantynivka. Nevertheless, it's important to note that there are individual Russian tanks that are still active at the front. The vast majority of tanks and armored vehicles, however, are being held back for a point in the future that we don't know, a moment that the Russian High Command will decide when to act on, whether to actually deploy genuine mechanized units or to continue relying on infantry and motorcycles instead. We continue moving southwest along the front, heading into the Dnipro region, and unfortunately the Russian army is still managing to advance further in this area. In just the last 14 days since our last broadcast, we've seen, as we'll look at on the map shortly, about 5 to 6 new villages have come under Russian control. Now we'll take a closer look at one of them, the battle for Berezov, from the Russian perspective of the whole thing. And first we see massive bombardment with glide bombs with so-called cabs of different weight classes, 250 kilos, 500 kilos, some of them 1,500 kilos, being dropped on Berezov and the surrounding forest ridges to initially combat and destroy the entire Ukrainian positions from a distance. You have to say it clearly, so that when the Russians get closer, first with kamikaze drones, we'll see that in a moment, and then also with infantry, we now have very weakened Ukrainian positions. Next we see, for example, here the attack of a Molniya drone. I hope we can capture it briefly. Here's the Molniya drone approaching, from the right, from our perspective. These drones are fairly straightforward, costing just a few thousand euros, yet they remain highly effective for the Russians. Molniya means lightning, meaning they strike like lightning from the sky. We can see that here as well, a fixed wing or a straight wing aircraft, and often a TM-62 anti-tank mine loaded up front or some other heavy payload, which allows that when they hit a house, and of course the Russians assume Ukrainian soldiers are inside, it results in such massive explosions. So the whole thing, yes, in this case, the residential building, which the Russians initially either forced the residents to flee or where they fled themselves, and which is then occupied by the Ukrainians, then this residential building turns into a death trap, as the Russians operate in a very similar way to the Ukrainians, deploying kamikaze drones and conducting bombing runs, as we can see now, and then completely level the whole area before they go in with the infantry, as just mentioned. We also observe additional attacks with fiber-guided drones targeting various vehicles there. Now we're seeing the Russians' typical footage, clearly highlighting their flags now in the village. And it's a relatively large village, as we can see, about 4 or 5 streets, formerly over 1,000 inhabitants. Beresov, which has also now been captured by the Russians. And with this tactic, that is, first with these massive airstrikes on every single village, then with these drone attacks where literally hundreds of drones are deployed to attack every known Ukrainian position, whether it's mobile or entirely stationary and fixed. The houses, the forest position and fortifications, as well as the supply vehicles. With this tactic, they were able to achieve a relatively good level of progress here in the Dnipropetrovsk region. We're looking at the whole thing on the map and now see once again the situation from 2 weeks ago and from today. You can already see a pretty significant difference. What we just witnessed was Beresove. Let's take a moment to focus on that and observe. This is essentially the current situation we're recognizing right at this moment. We can observe the orange and red zones contested and Russian-controlled, stretching far to the west. Kalinivsky is another village that has also come under Russian control. Up there we had Novoselivka, Sosnivka and several others. We've only marked the larger ones, all now under Russian control. That means, unfortunately, you can see that while the Ukrainians were saying just a few months ago, yeah, in Dnipro there's no major danger, we're not really afraid of a Russian offensive there. We can try to mark it relatively well. That means this entire area here, that's approximately 80 square kilometers, of course. They are now under Russian control, including areas a bit further to the south. We've just seen that as well. In the Zaporizhzhia region, the red area and the orange area are steadily moving westward. That means the Russians are relatively successful here and have also, as mentioned, managed to seize roughly around 50 square kilometers in the Zaporizhzhia region over the last 2 to 3 weeks. The goal of the Russians is the next major city, and that is Pokrovsk, not Pokrovsk to be clear, but Pokrovsk in the region, as I mentioned, Pokrovsk. This is the central hub here for supplies, the primary logistics center, actively supporting both the eastern front heading toward Donetsk and the southern front moving toward Zaporizhzhia. It's the golden apple of the region for the Russians, who are determined to capture Pokrovsk and are investing significant resources to achieve their goal. We saw it, the Ukrainians were able to hold their ground well in Donetsk, especially in Pokrovsk, keeping it all together. Here in the south, that means in the Dnipropetrovsk region, the Russians are currently not only superior in numbers, but also in firepower, and therefore manage to gain a few meters every day, sometimes even kilometers forward. Let's examine a third front section at the center of Donetsk region, the area surrounding the Russian-occupied town of Kremina and the still free town of Lyman nearby. Here too, the Russians are trying to advance. We have a video that shows us that the Russians are also attempting to bring in tanks, at least covertly, within the forest. Again, infantry comes first, motorcycles come first. However, then they try, once they've established themselves here, so to speak, once they've established the front, once they've pushed further, then they make an effort to bring these tanks forward, ensuring they have at least a handful of actual armored units that can support the advance. But again, these tanks are very, very rarely seen out in the open here. Instead, everything is, as we can see in these images, a very forested area. That means these tanks, we can see, also have a fixed shelter, and they also have this, well, this camouflage that's built over them. We see it here again, the entire structure that's now burning. That means they're using these more as a kind of artillery, which moves out briefly from the forest and then fires accordingly. Nevertheless, the Russians were relatively successful in this area as well. Let's take a closer look at it. Around Lyman, and we can clearly see that it's a triangle shaped by 3 distinct regions. On the left side, I'll try to mark it here, up at the top, that entire section belongs to Kharkiv Oblast. The Kharkiv region, this here is the Luhansk region, which is already 99% occupied. And finally, we can observe this large area situated down here, the one we're currently looking at now. This is once again the Donetsk region, where heavy fighting persists, and Ukraine still maintains control of approximately 30% of this territory. Let's have a look now. If we run it again, this is the situation from 2 weeks ago. And now we'll see what happens when we let the whole thing run up to today. We can see that here. In this region around Lyman, north of Severodonetsk, the Russians have advanced into the Serebryansky forest, a very large wooded area that had been held by the Ukrainians for a long time, which is now being increasingly overrun. We can see that because Shandry-Holov was partially captured by the Russians, along with several other villages across the surrounding region. And what we just saw was the footage from Terny, where that Russian tank was being attacked. And we see that it's actually roughly, so behind the main front towards the west, it's positioned around 20 kilometers further back. The Russians are carefully safeguarding their tanks, keeping them away from the front line. And still, in this case, the Ukrainians managed to do it, probably by conducting reconnaissance from here in the southwest, precisely that whole thing, to spot it in the forest and as a direct result to carry out the attack on the tank near Terny here. And while Russia continues to capture small villages in eastern Ukraine, Ukraine has its sights set on major Russian targets. Once again, we're starting with attacks on refineries, a sector where Ukraine has achieved significant success over the recent weeks and months. This morning, yet another attack occurred. Let's first take a closer look at the situation. That is one of the kamikaze drones that was launched directly towards Russia. And this here is an attack that occurred just a few days ago on the large refinery in Saratov. We can see here a passerby or someone living nearby is pointing to the drone, which is just descending now, directly flying straight into the refinery. Now we can see over on the other side of the forest the massive explosion. And what we can clearly observe from it is indeed a major fuel problem that's rapidly spreading. This is Nizhny Novgorod, which is a major Russian city in the center of the country, just a few kilometers east of Moscow. We're seeing these long gas station lines steadily growing longer across the entire country. This means the Russians have successfully managed to seize control of individual small villages, likely around 20 in just the last 2 months. And the Ukrainians in turn destroy 20 refineries in Russia, which of course presents a much larger long-term and strategic problem for the Russians. But it's not just refineries being targeted. We also continue to see Ukrainian attacks on Crimea, which has been occupied and annexed since 2014. And these attacks are extremely interesting because they show us exactly how Ukraine is proceeding here. That they are approaching Crimea with sea drones, getting within a few kilometers, a few dozen kilometers, and then smaller, if you will, attack drones take off from that location and begin their flight. And then in this case here, attack airfields of the Russian army. We first see a Russian Mi-8 combat helicopter that gets attacked and also hit here. And next, in my opinion, I think we see it here. A seaplane, quite interesting indeed. Old Soviet-era models, still in active use here, the BE-12 type. Multiple units are being actively targeted here by the Ukrainian army. Another seaplane or a naval aircraft, which is currently under heavy attack by the Ukrainian forces. And we see these are relatively successful attacks by various drones that take off simultaneously, fly one after another, and target the airfields. The whole thing is possible because the Russians obviously no longer have the air defense they would like to have, since the Ukrainians have destroyed an enormous amount over the past weeks and months. Right now, Mi-8 helicopters are being attacked one by one, along with radar units targeted. That means when the Ukrainians realize we've reached this airfield, they also start focusing on the still operational radar systems. Here's another Mi-8, fairly easy to identify. Down here we see basically a pod where you can load the unguided for S-8 rockets if you want to. However, this helicopter probably won't be flying anymore. And in the end here, the Ukrainian intelligence service, specifically the GUR, the military intelligence, shows a satellite image that indeed confirms the helicopters. In this particular case, the Mi-8 here, I hope you can see it, were indeed destroyed and are no longer usable or deployable by the Russian army. I just said for these attacks, air defense systems must be destroyed repeatedly. We were just in Ukraine a few days ago talking to soldiers, and they told us we haven't even come close to destroying the entire Russian air defense yet. But we're actively working on it, and this ongoing effort is clearly visible here in another video where a Buk M2 system is being destroyed. We can see this relatively well here. It shows again that such a Buk M2 system, which is deployed here, costs around 25 million euros. Once more, as said before, the reconnaissance, meaning a surveillance drone, possibly a Shark, Leleka or Vector, carried out the reconnaissance mission here. That means the data is currently being utilized here and passed along. Apparently the system isn't even aware that it's just been detected. And now we're about to observe an impact, likely from HIMARS or potentially from 155mm artillery right beside it. And then we see the system exploding. We see the rocket fuel, which here is very peculiar, or rather very typically shooting up into the air. And this whole thing led to another Buk M2 system of the Russian army being destroyed, and the Ukrainians securing their corridor and their opportunities westward towards the occupied territory, but also eastward, of course, towards Ukrainian territory or towards Russia. They were able to expand their reach once again. But it's not just Ukraine using its long-range weapons to hit targets far behind the front lines. Russia also attacks Ukraine every day, especially cities with cruise missiles and drones. Let's take a look at one of these recent attacks that happened just a few days ago in Dnipro, a million-strong city in the southeast of the country. We're seeing an eyewitness here, as we can see, filming what's called an KH-101 cruise missile, which presumably crashes into an industrial area here right behind a gas station. We're seeing here this truly massive explosion behind the gas station in Dnipro. And we see these attacks continue to occur every single day in Russia as well. Yes, what is Ukraine doing? We see it here in the video. They are increasingly using F-16 fighter jets. Interestingly, F-16, which, practically with NATO or mainly Western states, seen in recent decades for offensive operations, deployed, for example, against the Taliban or ISIS or similar. Ukraine, on the other hand, uses the AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles, which are mounted here under the F-16, primarily for defense against drones and also cruise missiles. Right now, we're seeing footage from the Ukrainian military, which shows us what such an attack looks like, how they essentially, from inside the F-16, they aim with this Sidewinder missile at just a few meters, unfortunately, of distance. That's why it's extremely dangerous for the Ukrainian pilots just to shoot down kamikaze drones or cruise missiles. Here we see some of these images. First, from a first-person view, so to speak. Actually, the explosion too. Here it is. The rocket's moving on the right side. And then, of course, the explosion. Here we see it happening right now. The explosion that takes place up in the sky above. Ukraine now has a significant number of these fighter jets, and it's growing so they can act more systematically against drones and cruise missiles. Here we are currently observing at least 3 F-16 fighter jets actively in operation by Ukraine. The whole thing was also filmed from the ground, and that's quite interesting because it shows us once again just how dangerous the operation is, firing these missiles from just a few meters away. Here's the spot we just identified. We'll get a much clearer view of it in just a few moments. This F-16 is about to launch a missile. Now we can clearly see it in action. It takes off, flies towards the drone presumably ahead of us and explodes. And we see how just a few seconds the pilot has to get out of the way directly. So the kamikaze drone with its 100 kilos of explosives to basically get out of the blast radius in time. Yes, another flight here as well. The F-16 fires its missile, swiftly turns away, and then the explosion lights up the sky. That means Ukraine has indeed achieved in a highly innovative manner to utilize these fighter jets originally designed for offensive operations. Unfortunately, it has already lost 3 of these jets in these highly risky missions. However, and that's at least the information we've received from Western countries, the number of F-16s in Ukraine continues to grow steadily. It's likely now 30, maybe even 50. Of course, all of that is top secret. And we can see that Ukraine is consistently and effectively intercepting a growing number of these drones and cruise missiles. That is, of course, the crucial point. What they need for that is ammunition. However, there's now this mechanism where NATO countries in Europe can purchase the ammunition from the United States. They then resell it to Ukraine. And so, at least in this regard, the demand seems to be currently covered.